ILR, shaping the next 75 years of work.
Good evening. Welcome to day 3 of the ILR Alumni Association Sports and Entertainment week of webcasts. Today's topic is Leading Through Crisis. My name is Eric Fisher. I'm class of 1998, and we got a great panel that I think will give us a great conversation about our respective sports and COVID-19 and how we were able to pull off what we've all been pulling off for the past 7 months. With me today are 3 panelists. We have Sean Sansevieri, Vice President with the NFL Players Association. We have Jeff Aubrey, a Senior Director with the NBA. And we have John Daniels, the General Manager of the Texas Rangers. Before we get into it, I want to point out that there is an Ask a Question box on your screen. So if you want to hit that and ask us a question, just as soon as you have a question, fire it away. We will get to it at some point, either within the flow or at the end. I think I'll throw it to the 3 panelists, and I'd love for each of you to give the group a brief description of your job, and then for those who may not follow sports as religiously as others, a brief description of what your sport has done to date, whether it took a pause and then restarted, whether it was in person, in a bubble. So for me, I am Madison Square Garden Entertainment's lead corporate attorney. In that capacity, I also do work with our sister companies, Madison Square Garden Sports, which is the owner of the Knicks and the Rangers, and Madison Square Garden Networks. So as you know, for the Rangers got to play in a play-in playoff game in Toronto, one of the NHL cities in Canada that were identified for the Stanley Cup playoff tournament. We had a brief run of 2 games and then a quick exit where we won the NHL lottery. So it all works out for us. Sean, why don't we go to you first?
Sure. Thanks, Eric. Hope everyone's doing well tonight, staying safe. My name's Sean Sansevieri, Vice President of the NFL Players Association. I oversee health and safety, medical research, and strategic growth. In terms of our sport, we had the benefit of time, unlike many of our colleagues. We were able to put a plan in place and spend several months doing so, and actually ended up delaying parts of the off-season, ended up having a virtual off-season prior to actually kicking off. So we learned a lot from some of the panelists here today and other sports in terms of what they implemented, and it served us well and has continued to serve us well.
Thank you. Jeff.
Yeah, Jeff Aubrey. Like you said, I'm a Senior Director in NBA Player Development. So generally, I'm charged with leading our transition programs, our rookie transition, our draft combine education program, and our team awareness meetings. We design and execute educational programming for players. We do a lot of one-on-one mentoring and are generally a go-to in terms of direct player communication. The NBA, again, suspended play in March, was the first league to do so, and we started planning almost immediately for how to restart as safely as possible. So we had the NBA bubble in Orlando. We took over Disney. We spread our players, 22 teams across 3 hotels, and we're able to successfully restart, go through a season, play 8 seeding games, and have our entire finals with playoffs, which ended, of course, in the finals with the Lakers and the Heat, with the Lakers winning a championship. So, obviously the challenges were many, and there were a lot of lessons learned on the way. We like to say we were building the plane while we were flying it, and hopefully we're able to share some of those lessons with other leagues to help them with their successful start as well.
Thank you. And John, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Eric, and thanks for having me on here. We were at I guess we were all at unique points of our season. We were in the middle of spring training, about 10 days away from breaking to start our season. We back up first. I'm the general manager of the Texas Rangers, the baseball team, so I oversee everything on the baseball operations side. From the big league team, the minor leagues, scouting, acquisition, R&D, medical, and performance. So like I said, we were in the middle of spring training, 10 or so days away from breaking camp. Obviously, the news in March was moving quickly. We were having daily meetings with the team as well as the league to decide what to do. And really, when the NBA, when the Jazz and Oklahoma City Thunder had their on court positive, and kind of led to a quick avalanche of news and changes. And so we broke camp there in the middle of March, headed home. League officially decided to shut down a couple days later. It took us until about late June to get started back up again. Part of that was due to COVID. Part of that was due, quite frankly, to labor negotiations. And we started a 60-game season in late July in lieu of our typical 162-game season. And the league is in the final 2 rounds now of the postseason that they've been doing at neutral sites.
One of the things I loved about the panel that was set up for tonight was sort of not only were they different sports, we have basketball, football, and baseball represented, but it's also different roles within the different sports. We have someone representing a league, someone representing a team, and someone representing a union, which I think gives just entirely different perspectives of how we all were sort of thrown into the mix to tackle the same problem. Sean, was the Players Association's relationship with the league on COVID collaborative, or was it adversarial?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated question, but a good one. I mean, you got to start by taking a step back and looking at labor management relationships generally, which did not differ that great in this instance. I mean, everything we do is from the vantage point of the NFL as the employer having the obligation to provide the safest work environment possible. And it's our obligation at the NFLPA to ensure the NFL is always doing a better job when it comes to health and safety. We have several guiding principles that guide our work, whether it's in concussion protocols or whether it's in COVID, and it's threefold. First, health and safety is non-negotiable. Second, we'll go anywhere the science takes us and nowhere it doesn't. And third, it's all about whole player, whole family, whole life. So in the context of COVID, we worked really closely with the NFL to create a set of standardized protocols that are intended to mitigate the risk of virus transmission. We all have to recognize that everything we do during a pandemic is about risk mitigation, not risk elimination. And we can't fit the virus into football. We have to fit football into the virus. So to that end, the working relationship has been very collaborative to date. We've had a lot of fights, trust me. We've had fights as recently as last night. We had fights when it came to the investigations around New England and Tennessee, but ultimately we landed in a good place, updating and enhancing the protocols from what we're learning and trying to keep this train on the tracks.
John, similar question, although not necessarily collaborative versus adversarial, more how much input do the teams have in a lot of these decisions, or was the league really driving the bus?
It's a great question. So first of all, I love how Sean kind of phrased the roles there for both the league and the PA, and I think ours were very similar. I think a lot of what played out publicly for us was more was not about the health and safety issues, but rather some of the economic challenges that come with kind of resetting the trap, as we all had to do. As far as team involvement, MLB I think did a really good job, especially early on when there was a lot of time. Right, April and May was really a lot of downtime for us. No minor leagues, no big leagues. We had an extended runway to kind of get ready, and so there were a number of calls. A number of committees formed, and they really did a good job of soliciting kind of on-the-ground feedback. I think one of the challenges that MLB has is they have a lot of really bright people, but they don't have a ton of people that have club experience. And I think they recognize that, and they did a great job of soliciting that feedback and trying to get ahead of some of the operational and logistical challenges that would come with putting in all the protocols necessary.
Jeff, you had mentioned, I think you called it building the plane while you were midair. So we all saw the Jazz Thunder game and the season getting canceled out from under everyone in real time on live television. I remember because I happened to be on a call with internal MSG people at that time trying to handle our own COVID-related issues when, everyone's phones all blew up at the same time that a game was canceled midstream. Had the league, Jeff, been contemplating this as a possibility, or I don't use putting our heads in the sand pejoratively. More like we were all just hoping for the best and hoping that it wouldn't come to this, and there's no need to sort of game out this nightmare scenario, and then here we are.
Well, I think some of the scenario planning had started earlier than that. But as we always assume, we look at athletes as being the healthiest of us and somewhat immune. I think the whole country was taken by surprise. Clearly, while other countries were already suffering, we were amazed that now, famous athletes were getting, were catching the virus. But I think we were able to look at what was happening in China at the time because of our offices there, to see at least how they were handling it, what was happening, how quickly it was spreading, and to some degree assume that we were susceptible to the same outbreak. I know there were some concerns that were discussed in February for All-Star, but were quickly kind of dismissed. But when it hit with that Utah game and that cancellation, I think, which is why we moved so quickly, because we saw how it happened in China. So we used the information we had from those offices and, wanted to make sure we got out ahead of it before the numerous outbreaks amongst players and staff. So for me, I think, how quickly it hit the entire world and how fast some companies, some industries were able to respond was really important. And then, to be able to come back in the midst of it with protocols in place is a really good indication for the rest of the world that that we can manage it if we're responsible, if we're vigilant. So the number of sports that have been able to come back, NFL, MLB, NHL, have been a clear demonstration of that vigilance and the success of it.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from each of you, and you've hinted at some of these things already, but I'd love to hear. Give me some of the biggest hurdles to getting back to the playing field or the court or the diamond that you encountered in your respective sport. Like when it was at its lowest point, everything shut down. We don't know when it's going to reopen. What were some of the biggest hurdles to getting from there to pulling off what we've all pulled off so far? Let's start with John this time.
Yeah, one of our biggest challenges was the preparation of our players. So we had our guys were basically and fully ready to go. They'd been built up physically, and we were less than 2 weeks away from opening day. We did a total shutdown. So we had a lot of kind of health and performance considerations there, and workload management, and just trying to keep. We didn't know where the starting line was, right? None of us did. So that was, I think, the biggest challenge was trying to keep them ready, but not ready for what? I think athletes in general, there's always a finish line. There's always something to aim for. They can kind of map out their programs. They can be ready for something specific, and we couldn't give them that. So it was a matter of, we called it like keeping the engine idling. We didn't want guys to totally shut down. We were concerned. We didn't know how long of a ramp-up period would be given. Once we restarted, we were worried about arm injuries and soft tissue injuries, a lot of which came to light, and we had a big spike as an industry. So that was one of our biggest challenges that we face as an industry.
Yeah, I'm going to echo what John said. Getting a diverse constituency that is our membership, all to have buy-in to something that would look very different. Like I said before, playing a contact sport with a contact disease takes a lot of education, a lot of buy-in, not from only our members, but everybody. And, to do that, back in March, we pulled together a team of the top infectious disease experts and emergency preparedness experts in the entire world. We were very heartened to see the people that were willing to come to our aid and help us build this plane, because we hadn't taken off yet. But we were about to do that with rosters of 132 team cities and staff members of 200. And of course, we have to take into account all of their families and how the communities would be impacted when we're thinking about testing resources, and other impacts on those communities. So we started looking at various iterations of what it would take to not only start an NFL season, but to finish an NFL season. And obviously that we're still in the midst of that right now. Once we formed our own plans, we then formed a joint task force with the NFL and started negotiating these protocols and writing them and figuring out what would it take to get our members back to work. And so we looked at all these issues. Every single one of them had their own challenges. And frankly, probably could talk 2 hours on each of these subjects. But the obvious ones were things like testing, treatment, contact tracing, isolation, this idea of a possible bubble concept in the NFL, which we could probably revisit because of the logistical challenges and some of the health and safety concerns that are part and parcel to that were real. Travel, disinfection, PPE, education, media, enforcement of protocols. And protocols only so as good as its enforcement ultimately is. And then we had less obvious ones that I think a lot of people still don't think about. I mean, the COVID tests that were deployed by the time we started our season had not been validated in an asymptomatic, young, healthy population. We've now done almost 500,000 tests on our players and staff, and we know so much more about what those tests mean and what they can be used for ultimately. Similar sort of more scientific leaning challenges were cycle thresholds, for instance. The number of cycles it took to actually run a sample to tell a positive or a negative, and where the false positives ultimately fell. And so we now know that range of CT or cycle thresholds when we need to rerun a test, or we can take it as a confirmed positive or an ultimate false positive or false negative. And then the list of challenges goes on when you think about daily testing and hiring a national laboratory to deploy over 250 tests a day in 32 different cities, and then rerunning samples, conducting genome analysis when you have a positive so that you can figure out where it actually came into the building so you can make the protocols better. So lots of challenges, new challenges every single day, but we're addressing them as they arise.
Yeah, I think the biggest hurdle, and I think you all mentioned it, was the player buy-in. My department specifically went through leveraging player relationships, having conversations about what the possibilities are. Even before we settled on the bubble as our strategy, we wanted to hear what their concerns were. We wanted to be able to troubleshoot early and know where the pain points were so that we could address them. We could design a plan that they would be willing to help execute. Obviously, there were some challenges in the bubble, leaving behind family, the daily testing, the rigorous health protocols. But we had to make sure that they were on board for that before we started pushing forward with it. So having their input and having their assistance in the original planning was a huge component in the success of our bubble. And I think very similar to what Sean is mentioning, the PA was very important in that whole process. They were hands-on with every part of it, and had to be, because so much of their responsibility is player health and wellness, obviously a priority for us as well. So their input was really important. We had members of the PA in the bubble as well that spent a significant amount of time there. Even the executive director, Michelle Roberts, was in the bubble, actively interacting with people, understanding exactly what they were experiencing, and in the moment, thinking of ways to improve their experience, to improve the protocols, make sure that they were adhered to, and not to mention at the same time, we had a number of social justice issues coming to the forefront. This was a huge point of pain for everyone that was in the bubble. Staff included. What we're experiencing in the world, aside from COVID, had a huge impact on everything we did, and was part of the motivation we were able to get players to buy in, to give themselves a platform to address things publicly and be able to make an impact. So, for me, those points were extremely important, because there was a moment after George Floyd's murder that players didn't want to do anything. They didn't want to participate. They didn't want to go back to play. And the ability and the opportunity to speak on it and publicly be a beacon for the change that was needed in our country was a huge motivator for them to accept the rules that we had to put in place in the protocols. So for me, I think that that had a huge part to do and was a huge hurdle that we had to get over.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. We have our first question from one of the listeners, and their question is, how did the leagues and players associations deal with pressure from politicians in creating the return to play plans? And that's an interesting question because there was pressure coming in both directions. On the one hand, you have governors like Andrew Cuomo, who was not particularly enthusiastic about mass gatherings and reopenings, especially in March, April, May, June. And then on the other hand, you have governors like Ron DeSantis in Florida, who's encouraging everyone to reopen as quickly as possible, even to the point where I believe that at least one, if not more than one, NFL team are rejecting his offers of expanding the crowds in the stadiums. Sean, what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, Eric, you hit it on the head. The pressure comes from both sides for sure. There was this hurry up and get back to football because we all need it for normalcy. But on the other side, there was, is this safe? And while these relationships and the input is important, we have relationships with certainly the local communities on the state, national, and even the more local levels. So we have that obligation. But what we were doing, I think, and I still believe, was going above and beyond ultimately what was being asked of us in terms of safety protocols. And we've seen that play out in several respects, whether it is travel bans or travel quarantines that are exempted for professional sports based on our testing protocols, and a number of other examples that what we've ultimately implemented has become the model even outside of sports.
Jeff, do you have anything to add to that? In particular, you were facing a different kind, because of the racial justice and the way that the NBA embraced that, you were facing a whole different set of political pressures, I think, that the other sports didn't really have to face as directly as you did.
Yeah, I think it was important that for our players, for our staff, that we stay true to our DNA. And from the beginning, the NBA has been in the forefront of pushing for change, in our society. So that's where we stayed. I think there was pressure. There was certainly outreach from the president, not just governors, about encouraging leagues to go back and play, which I'm sure you all know. And part of it you take in, but at the same time you're running a business, which you want to do safely. You want to prioritize the health and safety of your players, of your staff, and as long as you stay true to those things, the core of who you are, then I think the pressure that was coming from both sides is just a little bit, what we would call maybe a bit of a distraction, but didn't have all that much impact. I think there were team governors that were influenced, just like there were players who were influenced. There were a number of players that opted out of the season, and we had to be sure that they had the ability to do so. We didn't want to force anyone to do anything that they were not comfortable doing. So we had to make that clear from the beginning that this was an option that players had, and we stood by that. I think it was interesting that when we originally planned for our bubble to be in Orlando, the rates in Florida were extremely low. It seemed as if the best place we could possibly do a bubble. And then the minute we arrived, their rates skyrocketed, and we ended up having a clean space in the middle of what was deemed the epicenter of the pandemic. So I think no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy, and we definitely had to adjust to what was happening around us.
John, so you had said earlier that the biggest hurdle in pulling off the season was, at least from your perspective, was helping the players prepare for a moving target. But once the season actually got up and running, were there any sort of unforeseen, unplanned for challenges that you found that you had to deal with on the fly?
It's a great question. So I think I'm not sure it was unforeseen, because we definitely had discussed it, but I just think it was such a unique setup that we couldn't, we weren't totally prepared with with the scope of this problem, and that was really mental health challenges of being in a quarantine. And so we did not opt for a neutral site for a variety of reasons. We ultimately ended up having a kind of regional schedule, which meant that you would travel. We travel by team charters. I'm sure all the leagues do at this point. But we would go into hotels and we would have to establish team by team rules. The league did not mandate kind of rules at the hotel, and so we were fairly restrictive, especially early on, and not allowing guys to go outside with just a couple of exceptions. And I remember our first road trip, we played Oakland and San Francisco. We were in the same hotel for 8 days, and I'm sure Jeff's kind of laughing at that after their experience. They were in the same hotel a lot longer than that, but the challenge of that of not being able to kind of hang out at the ballpark the way that players, the culture of the sport is, the face-to-face, the individual coaching, the development that would take place at the park. We were limited to 5 hours a day at the ballpark before the game, and you had to leave pretty much right away. You couldn't hang out in each other's rooms. The players could not. We did set up a kind of a restricted ballroom that allowed players to have some sort of social interaction, but most of these guys were not with their families. And we found it took a significant mental toll on these guys. And then when you add in the social justice challenges we had and continue to have, it was a burden on these guys that was a lot bigger than I think we anticipated going in.
So I don't want to put the pressure on you, John, but we have a question that I think is aimed directly at you. So I'll fire away. The question is, in what ways did you continue to engage the minor league teams during a season where they aren't playing?
Great question. So there's kind of two ways I could take that. One is the minor league teams themselves, like the franchises that operate the minor league teams, effectively were empty venues because we did not send any minor league players out to their affiliates. So those minor league teams, which are independent businesses, tried to host events and raise revenue the best that they could. Our minor league players, we did as much virtual player development as we could. We were prohibited by the league from having development camps for understandable reasons. We were allowed to have about 35 players in addition to our major league team at an alternate site in our big league city, which we did, and when we had a kind of a mix of depth to support the big league team as well as some of our most talented young players that we needed to develop. And as the course of summer went on, that we swung that more heavily towards young prospects that needed development time and less as we needed the depth. But it was a lot virtual, and I'm actually in Arizona right now. We have at our spring training complex, we have 60 players plus some rehab players, and we're really for the first time able to have a full-on kind of minor league development camp. We're playing other teams out here as well, so that's been a benefit. And we've had to put in place a similar type bubble and testing protocols, et cetera, out here with the minor league group that we did with the big league guys.
And Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, but the G League season was either already over or it was almost over when COVID hit. But I'll ask you the same question about your minor leaguers.
Yeah, no, the G League season was canceled. I mean, there was only about 2 weeks left.
Right. Okay.
But yes, it was canceled after the suspension. We continue to interact with G League players, particularly my department, which has a number of my colleagues that work specifically with G League players. So as we engage players throughout the hiatus with professional development opportunities, learning opportunities, guest speakers, et cetera, we made that available to all G League players as well. And we had very good engagement from G League players, as we traditionally do. We were able to provide some online learning opportunities that they were able to take advantage of. We work with a company called Game Plan that does a lot of professional development geared specifically towards athletes. And we had great participation in those programs as well. So we continue to interact with them consistently throughout the hiatus. And then what was interesting, because of players opting out of the bubble, a number of G League players got call-ups to come into the bubble. So it was just another, demonstration that the G League gives you a great platform in which to grow as a player and then prepare yourself for the next level, being the NBA. So a number of those players were able to come into the bubble and stayed the entire time, as teams were able to expand their roster within the bubble as well. So I thought it was a great opportunity. I just imagined in my mind, I played in the G League when it first started, being that guy waiting for that call to go to the bubble and how exciting that would be. So as I was able to greet some of those players coming in while I spent my time in the bubble, you could just tell that opportunity for them meant the world in the middle of a pandemic. To get your shot on this stage was incredible. So, I think going forward, we'll continue with the same kind of strategy to engage them. Right now, the Pro Select team, the Team Ignite, which is made up of a number of players who've left high school, who've graduated from high school and wanted to go straight to professional ranks, but are ineligible to get drafted. That team is already training, has been tested, quarantined, is doing professional development as well, and training in California as we speak, preparing to see what we do with the G League season, where their opportunities to play will be, and preparing for essentially for next year's draft.
That's great. Great. Sean, we have a question from the group, and that is, how is the family contact risk profile being considered and assessed, given, unlike the bubble, where at least for the first few rounds, the players were alone without families, in the NFL, at the end of the game, the players go back home to their families. So how are we assessing that risk?
Yeah, I mean, we're assessing that risk like we are most other risks of transmission. We're trying to mitigate it through a number of different strategies, including education, of course, and daily testing, which is a effective barometer to gauge how impactful or how efficacious the other aspects of our protocol actually are, whether it's PPE, whether it's education, whether it's physical distancing. Our statistics as of this week showed a 0.02 positivity rate among players. It's a overall about a 0.05% positivity rate among all players and all staff. So when you look at the total numbers, it's a fraction of 1% of positives so far in the league. But ultimately, when we're looking at various risk factors like family contact, we're looking at the data and making adjustments on the fly as we learn more and progress throughout the season. So it's an important consideration for sure.
So I want to ask one more question that we got from the audience, and then I want to sort of transition to the looking forward and getting fans back in the building and resuming sort of business as it used to exist. And so this last question is, how has conditioning and preparation been forced to change due to health guidelines and lack of space? So we sort of touched on conditioning and prep as it relates to knowing when the season would start and how many games there would be and how many off days you would get. But this is more about health guidelines, lack of space, whether that means training facilities, whether that means access to team trainers. I don't know who wants to take this one first.
I could start, I guess, especially for what was protocol in the bubble. So we started our phase one, which was players returning to markets, June 16th. They had a week or so to report to their markets once they had scattered during the hiatus. And then we started with testing. So we did a week of testing before we were allowing players to even do individual workouts. Now, the individual workouts were ruled by one player, one ball, one coach per court. So to keep players separate, to keep coaches separate, to be able to contact trace and maintain their social distance while they were preparing for their season. So we did individual workouts while testing for about a week or so before they traveled to Orlando. Once they got to Orlando, they were required to have the 7 days of negative testing before they arrived, and then 36 hours, 2 tests within 36 hours that were negative, and then they were allowed to resume now team training. So once they went through that degree of testing and quarantined within the bubble, they were allowed to do team training and team workouts as needed. So that they took about 10 days or so of practices to do a training camp to prepare players back for the game. What we didn't want to do was rush them back to play and then see a huge amount of injuries, soft tissue and others, as we discussed earlier, because their bodies weren't prepared for the the load that's required when you go into that kind of competition. But the individual training was a big point of emphasis, particularly as now we had off-season bubbles for teams that weren't allowed into the or didn't make the 22 team cut for the Orlando bubble. And each of those teams quarantined in their markets, went through rigorous testing, and then were able to do team functions. But those one-on-one workouts was what kept everybody in in good physical health and shape before they got to that point. So it's something that teams were regulating, doing having their practice facilities cleaned extensively in between trainings, and maintaining the one ball, one player, one coach rule on the court.
Yeah, Eric, I'll jump in. I mean, because this was a big fight for us. Ultimately, we've long had a concern about the injury rates in the preseason as one of the areas that the parties can control. I mean, this is an inherently dangerous occupation with over 100% injury rate. I think we had over 7,000 injuries among 1,600 players last year, and we're going to be on track for similar rates this year. So we negotiated hard for an acclimatization period that was battled against, from the leagues and the club's perspective, this competitive consideration, right? We have to be ready to put a product on the field. Our message was that these guys are professionals. They're staying in shape. We saw this in 2011 after our lockout, that we had a big spike in soft tissue injuries because guys didn't have an acclimatization period, guys didn't have an off-season training. This was going to be magnified 10 times because gyms are closed, fields are closed, guys can't get out there and train together. So we started with recommendations from some of our experts over at Exos, an elite training facility, and other experts on physiological loading, and ultimately fought for a 21-day acclimatization period, followed by a gradual ramp up with no contact, followed by a gradual contact integration period that was extended by duration, by number of contacts. We got really into the details of what was ultimately allowed there. And we're still looking at the data to determine whether it had an impact on injuries. Our early indications that injuries were relatively flat, which is probably a good thing, unlike 2011, where we had a big spike. Injuries are, of course, down because we had no preseason games. Therefore, we had no preseason game injuries. But when we're looking just at practices, it looks to be relatively flat. So definitely a big consideration, and something we fought for hard on behalf of the members.
John, do you have anything to add, or should I move on?
Not a lot unique, to be honest with you. Yeah,
Okay.
no. I will just say that I do think that there were some learnings that we had that, some of the excessive training is probably unnecessary from past. I do think that we can be a little more efficient. I think we learned what we really need and what may have been extra. And so I think we'll be able to be more efficient moving forward in our use of time.
So an audience member asked the perfect segue question for us. And that question is, even when fans are allowed back, what % of them won't feel comfortable? More or less than 50%. So I'll throw out my anecdotal view, which is that the demand is still there, that people are social animals and they are ready to come back out safely. If it can be done safely, they're ready for it. On MSG's concert side, the number of people that have elected to hold on to their tickets waiting for the rescheduled concert versus the number of fans that have asked for refunds was mind-blowing. People want to go out. They want that event to happen. They want it to happen safely, but when it does, they want to be part of it. Has anyone encountered anything that would disagree with that?
No, I think you're right. I think people want to get back to normal, and that once fans are back allowed in the building, it will be the hottest ticket in town, whether it be MLB, NFL or NBA. It's a part of our culture. It's who we are. as sports fans. And I don't see, even with the threat of the pandemic, once we have reverted back to allowing fans in the building, fans will be there, as evidenced by people currently not social distancing, going to parties, going to bars, ignoring the health regulations, just to feel that that they're back with people again. So I don't see that having that much impact once we're able to open the doors.
And I started with you for that one because of the three of you, yours is the only sport that is entirely played indoors. Obviously, some of the baseball and football teams have domes, but largely it's an outdoor sport, which has, a different risk profile, or at least a different assumed risk profile by most attendees.
Sure. I think what's interesting though is geographically where you live right now in this country has a lot to do with how you view this, the dangers at least. I live in New York, so where we were originally the epicenter of what was happening in the United States, and you see so many casualties, so many people sick, so many people dying in one place that obviously changes how you view this pandemic. But there are other places in the country that have not been hit as hard, that have been able to maintain relatively low levels of infection, that have a different view of it. And again, as you see images from all over the country of political rallies or outdoor events, I think LA streets were packed after they won the championship. It is clear that people are not afraid to gather. Even without a vaccine, people are not afraid to gather. So I think once we deem it safe enough to have fans back in the building, I don't imagine there'll be anything that'll keep them out.
Yeah, I agree with that, Eric. I mean, the demand is there. Whether it should be there or not is a different question. And that's a tough one. I mean, the CDC just released new information on the aerosol transmission of the virus. And whether that's outdoor transmission or indoor, it's something that needs to be taken into account. And I look at just the effort and it's Herculean effort that went in to keep our guys safe. And there's still transmission. I mean, this virus spreads incredibly easy. And so this idea of packing stadiums at this point is obviously jurisdiction dependent, but it strikes me. I mean, I don't know that I would go do it right now after being so close to this, but I agree with what Jeff and what you said, Eric, is the demand is there. If we can figure out or continue to figure out how to do this safely, it'll be back to normal before long.
I would agree. I'd echo what Jeff said as far as it being a little bit market by market, municipality by municipality, both in their experience with the virus as well as the political climate in that area. And we've just had some recent learnings in that we've had the Rangers are hosting the National League Championship Series right now at our ballpark, and we've had the previous two nights we've had fans for the first time all season, and so our capacity is about 40,000. We've had a little over 10,000 each of the games, so about 25%. And we did some basic surveying after, and just so you understand, I'm not really involved with that side of it, but what they're doing is they're selling tickets in pods of 4 that each pod is then socially distanced from other groups. And in the surveys they did after the 2 games, a bunch of information, but 95% of those surveyed suggested that they felt comfortable with both the communication on the protocols as well as how things were handled at the game. So a very small sample, only 2 games, but I thought that was interesting. And obviously we are also in an area that it has a very clear view of virus and of restrictions on it. But I did think that was interesting.
So John, on that point, when it was still in the middle of your regular season, when the NFL started and in certain markets were allowing fans, was there any pressure within baseball to let fans in those same markets?
Absolutely. So we had the Cowboys had a game literally down the block where they had 20,000 fans, and we were not permitted to have any. And I really think it came down to 2 or 3 issues. One, just a competitive fairness that not all municipalities were going to allow it. So would we be at a competitive advantage being allowed to have fans and ultimately have the revenue that our competitors would not? Two is just the basic health and safety. Did that put our players at greater risk? There was some question. There's enough question there that I think the league didn't want to deal with that, and quite frankly, I think the revenues associated with getting to and finishing the postseason were significant enough that they didn't want to put any of that at risk. And then three, and it's kind of tied to number two, is just the PR of it, right? The perception, the look of it. I don't think the league was ready to do that kind of midstream. They'd gotten that far and felt like they were better off, kind of sticking to the plan that had worked to that point.
So now the NBA season is over. It will start at some point in 2021. And it's an open question if or when fans will be allowed to return, whether that will be a league-wide decision, whether that will be jurisdiction by jurisdiction. Jeff, talk to us about that. Would the league, if there was a decision to allow fans in the building, what role would the league have, and what role would you envision the teams having with respect to that decision making?
Yeah. Well, I think, obviously it's our goal is to have fans back in the building. Part of the experience and the energy you get from watching live sports is having others to share it with. So we know that that's a huge priority. Again, if it could be done safely. I think there's no way some teams will have fans and others won't. Just from a league perspective, there has to be parity and balance between the teams. So that'll be a factor. And then again, regulations based on the municipalities that the games are occurring in, having a huge impact. Just as was said, I can't imagine that we'll push through or even put pressure on any local governments to allow games before they're prepared to do it. So part of it is, once we deem it safe, once there's an opportunity to be sure, whether it be a social distancing strategy that was mentioned, where we're selling pods or suites, but there'll likely be, and this is again just speculation on my part, I think there'll likely be opportunities for premium seating before it's open to the general public. There'll be suites because it's much easier to contain fans if you put them in a suite in an arena. And if you do every other suite, well, there's no way they come in contact. Now, I think what we also have to mention is the risk that we're putting on arena staff by allowing people in the door, right? We can't take that for granted, and that, it's not just fan health and safety, it is also staff. Keeping them away from players is easy enough with plexiglass and some of the things we were able to do in bubble arenas. We had a number of zones, a green zone with everyone who was currently in the bubble being tested daily, having temperature checks, blood oxidation levels, and all that monitored. But there was also a yellow zone, which people who had been tested, generally team governors and presidents, et cetera, as well as, Adam, Mark. Mark was in the bubble most of the time, but that would come to games and stay behind the plexiglass in different pods, away from players, away from other staff, but be able to watch the game live. So again, right now, there's no plans essentially to include that, but I could certainly see that being an option, just to start experimenting and figuring out what the best experience we can give fans while prioritizing their health and safety.
Yeah, I would just also add to that one of the things that struck me from the news over the past few days and weeks is what is assumed to be the super spreader event at the White House that took place a week and a half ago. Everyone there was tested before they were allowed to mix and mingle and hug and kiss and not wear masks, and they all tested negative, yet still someone brought it with them, and they had enough to be contagious, but not enough to test positive. So as we're thinking about, are we testing players? Are we testing fans? Are we testing the hot dog vendors and security guards? I'm not sure that's good enough. I'm not sure anyone's sure that's good enough. I guess, Sean, you would be the resident expert.
Yeah, I mean, testing cadence is just as important as the type of test. I mean, when you start with the type of test obviously sensitivity and specificity becomes really important. So many of these tests still have false positive, false negative rates above 5%. So there's a big window. So the type of test is important, but then the cadence is important. In our population, we've seen about 90% of tests emerge 5 days after exposure. The CDC gives a really large window of 2 to 14 days. So you can imagine, and this may have happened, where we have a free agent who comes in, does a couple tests, then starts working with the team, working with the club. God forbid he travels, and then he pops positive after that first 2-3 days in that 5-day period. So our protocols, for instance, now address a 5-day onboarding period for all free agents. You can't enter until the 6th day. You can imagine how hard it is to field a team when you have your backup quarterback or your quarterback from the practice squad get picked up by another club, and your starting quarterback goes down, and you literally only have one arm on your team to throw the ball. If you need to get somebody on board on a Tuesday, he's not going to be able to play on Sunday. So there's a lot of logistical challenges, but the White House situation is a great sort of comparison for some of the same challenges we're going through on testing.
So there's less than 10 minutes left, and this wouldn't be an ILR panel if I didn't end with these couple of questions that we got from the audience. And so the first one is, it's fascinating. I wouldn't even know how to start answering it, but I'll just ask it. And the good news is that I don't have to. Someone else will. Will the labor management relationships that have been fostered and collaborated and cooperated during this COVID period blend into future labor management relations? Do we see it bleeding over, or will the good times come to an end?
I'll jump in. I'll start if you want. So baseball is at a really unique point in that our CBA is up at the end of 2021. So it is almost exactly 12 months from expiring, and you're going to have this environment, this economic environment, this market that has a lot of factors involved now that aren't typical, to what we would expect, but from teams building and players going at it. And so I just think there's the unknowns of the loss of revenues from this year, the unknowns of what we're going to be able to do, for whether fans are going to be in the park, or we're going to be able to have the full 162 games next year, are likely going to lead, if not to the change in behavior of the past, are going to at least lead to a delay in that behavior. I would imagine, again, I'm speaking more for myself than all the clubs, but I would think that teams are going to need some answers to those questions before they make moves this winter. And why I think that's relevant to your decisions, because I think that is going to be the most recent taste in everyone's mouth, effectively, the most recent experience, in that you may have an exceptionally slow developing off-season and free agent market, largely because of these unknowns, potentially because of other economic factors like debt that teams may have had to take on. And that is going to be the backdrop for a significant negotiation that has already kind of, based on what happened in May and June and on our restart negotiations, got off to a rough start publicly. So I do think that it's going to have some lingering effects. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to build some bridges and not go into it on a negative note, but that is a concern of mine.
Yeah, we're a little bit on the opposite end of the spectrum. We came out of our CBA negotiations and closed a new deal right in March. We went to Miami for our annual Board of Player Reps meeting to vote on that deal. It passed. We all flew home, and then we started renegotiating the entire deal because of COVID. And the renegotiations haven't stopped since then. I mean, we were trading documents today on an enhanced aspect of the protocol that will probably go out tomorrow. We sent out something 2 days ago. So it's been a very long year, to put it the least. We've been negotiating, honestly, for about 12 months. But it dates back longer than this year. I mean, we negotiated an infectious disease prevention standards in 2014 as it relates to MRSA. So it's a lot of the same people in the same sandbox. We all always have to work together. Yes, it ratchets up, and there's a lot of that plays out in the press, and the relationship is important. But we continue to negotiate on behalf of our respective contingencies or constituencies, and this is no different.
Jeff, do you have?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the work we've been able to do together has been incredible. But I think what really, I think moves the needle is the work we've been able to do together around social justice. We've co-sponsored, kind of voting access and registration campaigns. The Social Justice Coalition, the new NBA, NBPA Foundation. I mean, these programs required a lot of trust and goodwill on both sides, and I can't see that not having an impact going further for our collective bargaining agreement coming in the future. But that is to say that when we're talking about money, everybody's priorities shift. So I don't think you could make a promise with that, but I do see the relationships being particularly strong between Adam and Michelle. Obviously, I think she was in a position considering, succession planning, who was going to come next, whereas now she's extended her term. So I think that could factor in terms of the amount of time they've been able to build that relationship and the work they've been able to do together. And by them, I'm referring obviously to Michelle and Adam. So I would say that would definitely have an impact because there's definitely been a lot of cooperation happening. So I'd see that being a factor going towards the next CBA.
That's awesome. And I would just add real quickly on that point that it's not just the players' associations, unions that are involved in sports. At the Garden, we have relationships with probably 30 unions total between electricians and stagehands and food service workers and ushers, ticket takers, security. And we had to they were right in the trenches with us. I think they would all agree that we were in the trenches with them. And maybe I'm an optimist, but I do think that it will help both of us. Each side will be helped by that relationship going forward. And then the final ILR question is, what from your ILR background did you find most helpful during this crisis? And alcohol tolerance is not an acceptable answer. So let's start with Sean.
Yeah, I'll say I never planned to work in sports, and I find myself for the last 10 years doing obviously collective bargaining, arbitration, everything in between that I learned about at ILR. And worth noting, what prepared me for law school. And law school obviously was the platform by which I ultimately entered into this profession. So I would say everything. I've referenced Upton Sinclair probably too many times in context of negotiations with the league in and around disease transmission. So I would just say everything and pay as much attention and appreciate it while you have the opportunity to do so.
John?
I might have been a poor selection because I did not go to ILR. I was an Army at Ag, so I apologize for the dud here. But commissioner of baseball went to ILR. Is a good friend of mine, AJ Preller, runs the Padres. So I'll go with their connections as my big contribution there.
Fair enough. Jeff?
Yeah, pass it over to a real ILR. No, I think organizational behavior classes have been really helpful from what I could remember, but there were definitely some principles and ideas that have stuck with me in understanding how people leverage power and authority within organizations and maneuvering for my programs that I lead while working with the MBPA, working within my own organization and being able to get to the root of who has the authority and who's going to tell me yes so I can move forward. There's a lot of player advocating I do in my role, and in partnering with the PA, it's important that I'm able to advocate and push for player needs within the NBA. So being able to understand how those dynamics come into play was really important. So, I had to go back and look at some things, but it was just refreshing the memory of those classes that I took way back when.
And I would just throw in that for me, it was money's important and the bottom line is important. And we at Madison Square Garden are in the mass gathering business. So it has been a rough year, but at all times, the focus has been on the workers and the work and making sure that they're safe, making sure that they've been taken care of, making sure that we are able to help them financially to the extent possible under the circumstances. And I think that all dovetailed nicely with my ILR education and background. And I think with that, we are out of time. So I want to really thank my three panelists and thank you all for participating and look forward to seeing you from the other side of this throughout the rest of the week.